sort of fancy and dramatic and theatrical. Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming this evening to the Oglethorpe University Museum of Art. My name is Elizabeth Peterson. I'll be your lecturer this evening and introducing a few other things. I'm so happy this week to have something to think about other than my Facebook feed and to work on finalizing the lecture and to think about this particular individual who, without having any particular personal investment in what he was doing, other than he felt it was the right thing to do, it was a humanitarian cause, he put himself in harm's way and helped a tremendous number of people. Incredible person. But before we talk about that, I want to point out a couple things to you. One is that we have some student art on view, which we'll have up through December 11th when the show closes. Our visiting professor from Dortmund, Anne Kristen Henson, did a very creative project with her German 101 students. So if you didn't see this, it was quite amazing. They did 3 different responses to Neumann's art. One was a complete play enacting the Alpha Omega series, complete with stuffed animals with fake blood, and all this drama and lighting and snakes and creatures. They were very excited about it. Then they also did artistic responses to particular works, and you see some of those. One is a collage, which was meant to as an homage to the self-portrait, which is our lead image. And then they did an artistic response with their own work, brand new work that they thought spoke to Neumann. So we're really happy to have the student work on view, and grateful to Professor Henson for encouraging them to be very creative in their response, and to Dr. Karen Head, who was here, and I think she's here today, who I'm happy to announce is one of our newest advisory board members for the museum, and an alumna, and a wonderful human being, and a beautiful writer who spoke with them about that as well. So, also, this is not our last, this is our penultimate lecture, so we have nothing next week. We've got Thanksgiving, and then we've got Dr. Scharfman, who will talk to you about degenerate art and Nazi art. So this is kind of a precursor to that. Certainly we'll be looking at some artists who were called degenerate by the Third Reich. Another point of pride here, I'm going to make an announcement that 3 students who just happen to work here at the museum, who are fabulously involved, were tapped for ODK, and I'm sure that Dr. Lutz, you came in from your sabbatical just to do this for them, which is wonderful. Larissa Randall, who you saw as you came in, Jordan Michaels, and Abby Argo. So if any of you don't know, that's the Honor Society, Omicron Delta Kappa. And we just found out that Larissa Randall has been given about $1,100 stipend for travel to the Association of Academic Museums and Galleries meeting, which is going to be on the West Coast. So we've got some fabulous museum superstars here in our students. We're really proud of them. Okay, so this evening let's talk about a fellow who's called the American Schindler because he's been eclipsed in history often by the work of Schindler, who of course was a German businessman who managed to save the lives of about 1,200 people who worked for him. This show, and the show that you see around you, the Neumann, came to us in very different ways, and I want to give you that background because they connect nicely. So we've got the Otto Neumann selections from the Rothschild collection, in here, the hallway in the Rubin Gallery, and the International Rescue Committee Flight Portfolio, which we'll talk about tonight. The impetus for the Neumann was a discussion that I had about 2 years ago with our president, Dr. Scholl, and Steve Rothschild, who's the grandnephew of the artist. He's also an Atlanta businessman, and he mentioned this incredible collection, so we made a connection. It became part of the Shelley and Donald Rubin exhibition series, which provides generously for exhibitions in perpetuity. Every fall we present a Rubin show and attended programming. The inspiration for the IRC Flight Portfolio, completely different. It was an email from a student, Leah Tongo, who's not here I don't think tonight, but Leah was interning at the IRC and sent me an email in the summer, in June, and said, this may be crazy, but I've seen these prints and they are beautiful. And I've learned this amazing story about this fellow named Varian Fry, and he was the person who thought that they should create these prints, and could we show them? Is that crazy? Could we show them? And not having any idea that I was doing the Neumann exhibition, which just so happens to perfectly coincide. So they're both of the same time period. They're both happening with the backdrop of World War II. But the thing that really came home to me is both of these shows celebrate the life of an ordinary man who rose to the occasion. Neumann was a depressive fellow. He, even in what we can surmise was the happiest point of his life in the 20s when he first was married, he was creating his Dante series, none of which shows you paradise, right? All of hell, it's all hell in there. But he kept working throughout his life, and every time he had any kind of life experience, whether it was the birth of a beautiful little baby or reading Greek mythology, he was creating. And he was also a German Christian who was married to a Jewish woman, and he adored her and refused to divorce her. So that was incredibly difficult, but through many miracles, they managed to stay together, stay alive, and live through the war. Varian Fry was a very ordinary fellow who was born in Manhattan. Well, before I go into this, I'm showing you all of the images of the flight portfolio. There are 12 different artists. All of this work is on view in the center gallery if you didn't have time to see this. He did not assist all of the people here in leaving Europe. We've got a few Americans mixed in here, Motherwell, Calder, and others, but there are 4 whose lives he helped to save. Let's see if this works. Yeah, we're gonna move. Not like last time. It's not pulling off of Citrix, I promise you. We'll go halfsies. I'll talk to you while we go halfsies here. And since we're still looking at the other slide in part, I'll tell you that Edward Pignon is one person whose work is, what's happening again? This thing is not my favorite. You want to just advance it by hand and get rid of it? Just pull it out of there so it doesn't refer to there. Thanks, John. As we do everything. Run up and down, kick your heels off, get up a ladder, go back and forth. Okay, so I was just saying that Edward Pignon, he was also French. He was involved during the occupation with the Front National des Arts, which, and he was one of the young painters of the French tradition who exhibited with Galerie Braun in May of 1941. So he was involved during the war. But there were 4 artists that this fellow helped specifically. So now that you can stay right there, John. Okay, so Varian Fry. This is the only existing picture of him as a child that we know of. He was born in New York, and his father was a manager of a firm on Wall Street. They moved when he was about 3 years old to Ridgewood, New Jersey. So he grew up in New Jersey starting in 1910. And he, when he was a little boy, he was about 9 or 10 years old during the First World War, he got involved in the war effort by trying to raise funds for the Red Cross by putting on a vaudeville act, and which involved puppets and vaudeville in a fish pond in some odd way. He was educated at private schools as a young child, and he dealt with bullying. He was a slight man. He was not a big guy, so I think as a young child he dealt with some bullying. But he poured himself into books. He was a multilingual student, which is, it's not surprising that he would be particularly adept at doing the work that he later did during the occupation. So he entered Harvard in the top 10% of his incoming freshman class. And you see this image of him, the one in the center is later, but the one on the right is when he was a student. He looks a little impish, a little puckish there, He, in his senior year, for the students who are here, I'm sure you would never do anything like this, he put a sign on the lawn of the dean that said "for sale," and he was expelled for his prank. I'm not sure if there's something else involved there, but a little sign that said "for sale." He was expelled. He had to talk his way back in. He had to redo his senior year. Yeah, so this is the beginning for this fellow. Now, while he was in, I don't know if this is when he was suspended, had to repeat his senior year, but as I was researching this, I found an interesting writing by a woman named Julie Oranger, who's a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard. And she and her research partners were looking into his life in the archives, and they found that he had had a summons to appear in court several times. And the sad fact of it is that he was driving his Packard and accidentally hit a young child who died. He was playing and darted out from between two cars. He died of his injuries. He was cleared of any wrongdoing, but you can only imagine that this young man who had had a kind of an idyllic childhood, bird watching and reading, and in New Jersey and New York, and a rather sheltered life, and then top of his class in Harvard, but couldn't take that seriously. Perhaps that sort of sobered him. That might have influenced him, and she surmised that perhaps that had psychological consequences for him that made him particularly empathetic to others and sensitive. So through his Harvard colleague, Lincoln Kirstein, with whom he founded the Hound and Horn, which is still in existence, he met his future wife, Eileen Hughes, who was also involved in journalism. And Fry, you'll find, it became a journalist. She was editor of Atlantic Monthly. They married in 1931. In his early life, he was a foreign correspondent for the American Journal, The Living Age, and he visited Berlin in 1935. And that was a real turning point for him because he saw firsthand Nazi abuse against several Jewish people that he reported back, and in incredibly graphic detail that I will save you from, which turned him into a bit of an activist. And he never forgot what he had seen, people being pushed to the ground, kicked in the face, buildings being torn apart. So he couldn't remain idle. He says, "I could not remain idle as long as I had any chance of saving even a few of its intended victims." Can you go to the next? Maybe we can go to the next. We'll try. The last time we had trouble with this, it's because we pulled from Citrix, but we're not doing that now. There we go. Okay, Emergency Rescue Committee. It may go to the next one. And the International Rescue Committee. Not the same thing. It's taking you to the next. Just press it one time back and leave it. Thank you. The IRC, is anyone here from the IRC today? Okay. Oh my gosh, go back again. You're going forward, John. Thank you. Usually I'm sitting where you are in the hot seat while the lecturer is vamping. Do a little dance. Thank heavens for you, Eli, you're laughing. I love it. We're all over the place now. This is not right at all.
It's still going backwards.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, while we're talking, okay, Emergency Rescue Committee was established in New York in the summer of 1940. You're getting a preview of everything. So in the wake of the defeat of France and the acceptance of Hitler's terms for armistice, the Emergency Rescue Committee was organized out of the leaders of a group that had been formed in 1935 called the American Friends of German Freedom. And that was intended to support socialist, anti-Nazi, underground Germans. And so some of the folks who were involved with this in the summer of 1940 developed the Emergency Rescue Committee. We're still, let's see where I'm at.
Go back.
Yeah, you're completely, you gotta go back 2, please. We're way ahead of ourselves. Oh my God.
All right.
Just leave it there, that's fine. Okay, let's see. So, fearing for the lives of all of these anti-Nazi refugees, intellectuals, and artists, the ERC determined that they should try to pool funding and send some people to try to smuggle people out of occupied France. They had a short list of about 200. That was what they had initially. The piece that I tried very hard to find and couldn't definitively pin down was why Varian Fry? Why? So if you look through his autobiography, Surrender on Demand, he simply says, they looked around, they tried to find somebody, and I couldn't find anybody, so I said I'd go. I'm sure it was a little more involved than that for him, but and the various connections that he had. But the rescue effort started in September of 1940, and by 1942, they had dissolved the bureau in Marseille for the ERC. The IRC, meanwhile, had been started. Oh, we finally went back. Unbelievable. Typically, we have this problem if we're pulling from Citrix, but this is on the desktop. So. Go figure there, folks. We'll keep trying our best. We'll try our best here.
Come back.
Yeah.
Oh my heavens.
It's on its own.
It's on its own. Well, that leaves me on my own, so I gotta move it forward.
No, I commanded it to go forward.
You commanded it to go
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah.
Okie dokie. All right, let's see. So, under the leadership of a fellow named Frank Kingdon, who was a Methodist clergyman, and a radio commentator named Raymond Graham Swing, which sounds like a wonderful radio commentator name, they organized this mission to locate a group of about 200 prominent refugees who were intellectuals and artists and writers of the time, and to arrange for their escape from occupied France and to find a way to transport them to America. This mission was intended to last 3 weeks. That was the plan. 3 weeks, 200 names, and they sent Varian Fry with $3,000 in his socks to Marseille with this list of names. Needless to say, he wasn't there for 3 weeks. He was there for 13 months. And it wasn't 200 people that he saved, it was several thousand. He did what he could while he could on the ground. Dare I try to get it forward? One more. While we're waiting for that. The ERC was funded by private donors, including the American art collector Peggy Guggenheim and the heiress Mary Jane Gould, who you see pictured on the right. So he certainly didn't work alone. Varian Fry needs to be better known by the public, but we also need to acknowledge that he had a team of people, many people who are unsung heroes here. Marion Davenport was an art student who had been living in Marseille. She happened to meet Mary Jane Gould, who was in Marseille as well, and Hiram Bingham IV. He was the son of Hiram Bingham III, who was the Connecticut senator who had very famously gone to Peru and rediscovered Machu Picchu, kept thousands and thousands of objects at Yale for about 100 years that were finally returned recently. But he was an archaeologist turned senator. And so this is his son, and Hiram Bingham IV had lived in Marseille and was the vice consul in charge of visas. So he was the fellow to go to for visas. Miriam had been a graduate of Smith. She had gone to Paris initially to study art, and Miriam's on the left there. And she ran into a number of different people, including the German poet Walter Mehring at Toulouse. And she learned from him about these issues of refugees at the hotels. So she'd gone on vacation and realized that there was this brewing, increasingly terrible problem. The armistice had been announced that had prompted the ERC to form. It said in so many words that any refugees had to be surrendered on demand. So they had come to France for asylum, and in the spirit of democracy, Varian and the others felt that they needed to keep that promise of asylum. So that was what prompted them to try to help. Miriam spoke both French and German, which not a lot of Americans did, as did Varian, of course. And that, combined with her knowledge of art, proved very helpful. And both of them, Miriam and Mary Jane, in their biographies, shamelessly basically say that they used their feminine wiles to also try to persuade officials, and Mary Jane's movie star good looks were helpful in trying to smuggle people out. If you've got to get people out of danger, I think you do it any way you can. So they had set this up to look as though it was simply refugee aid. They didn't have, so everything was covert initially, and it was later in the operation that it became more apparent and that they were able to procure the visas more openly. Dare I ask you to try to go ahead? Yay! It's moving. There we go. So by the end of May of 1941, they started to tally up all of the work that they had done, and in less than 8 months, 15,000 people had appealed to them for asylum. So they went with a list of 200 and the $3,000. 8 months later, 15,000 people had written to them. They had to consider every case. They had to decide which of those cases fell within the scope of something that they could do. So when you look at the research on this, you may find what appear to be conflicting numbers between 1,200, 1,500 people, 4,000 people were helped. In fact, both those numbers are correct. From what I have found, it's been about 1,800 cases in which they helped people to get out, and another 4,000 or so, 2,000 or so, whom they paid an allowance to or assisted in some other way, but didn't necessarily get them passage out of Marseille. So they had, by that point in May of 1941, they had managed to get 1,000 people out of France. And this is a quote from Fry. He said, "For the rest, we had made every kind of effort, from getting them liberated from concentration camps to finding them a dentist." So, life goes on even in the midst of all of this incredible difficulty. One of the things that they did for themselves and for the artists through this intense, difficult, covert action was to rent a villa on the outskirts of town. And so what you see here, and you see a couple of these photographs, is a place called Villa Herbel. And you'll see over here, for example, that's Wilfredo Lam, who's waving at the camera, and that's André Breton, and that's his wife. And on the far right is Daniel Benedict, who was a Frenchman who assisted Varian when he was unable to be at the main office. So, in December 1940, going back a bit, the villa was raided by the French police. They detained Fry and his colleagues on a ship in the harbor. And then the following month, Fry's passport expired. The State Department disapproved of his activities and refused to renew it. So he had arrived the summer before. From January of 1941 until he left in August of that year, he had no passport. So he was really skating on thin ice here. Okay, the next one, if you can. Thank you very much. Okay, and hopefully the next slide is Daniel Benedict, who, like several of the people who assisted Fry with this covert operation, he really had no idea what Fry was trying to do. He was a Frenchman on the left who had worked in the office of the prefect of police in Paris before the war. He was fluent in several languages, as was most of the people who worked in this small office. And he was a very pivotal part because he was very charismatic and was able to win a lot of people's friendship, and as a French national, he was able to win a lot of people's confidence. You can imagine Varian Fry was in his early 30s. He was this brash, young, Harvard-educated journalist who is talking to artists who are 20, 30 years his senior, whose lives are in peril. And why should they trust this guy in this small hotel in Marseille? So Daniel Benedict assisted in winning their confidence. Anything happening? Oh, good. So you'll see him in a moment in a beautiful black and white photograph. I got a little quote from his book, Surrender on Demand, Fry's book. In Paris, Danny Benedict had much to do with refugees, winning their friendship by his kindness and his readiness to renew their permis de séjour, residency permit? Okay.
Yes.
Danny became the cabinet chief, took my place whenever I was too busy to see someone myself, performing 100 other tasks ably and cheerfully. When I hired him, I warned him that it would only be 2 or 3 weeks. Believing the consul general, I didn't expect the police to let us operate any longer than that. So there was a lot of people, for this to work, a lot of people were turning a blind eye, including a lot of the French police. His job, Daniel Benedict, his job lasted 4 years. So this operation continued for quite a long time. In the course of that time, he advanced from private secretary to leader of the underground network, which rescued many of the refugees and kept many others safe in hiding after the Germans had occupied the whole of France. So this young man became really, again, he's not very well known. To my knowledge, he's not very well known.